Hello, my name is Atoma Eji. Welcome to Image Bearers. This is season 2, episode 34. Have the great honor of having with us Dr. Joel Green, who is the New Testament Interpretation and Associate Dean of the Center for Advanced Theological Studies at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, California. Thanks so much for joining the program.
It's great to be with you again.
I know last time you were on, you were able to share a few things about your awesome book that you wrote, which I really love. I think for myself as a Christian, I've always had an issue with the point in time theology for conversion that I think is not biblical. And I think just reading your book really showed, along with the scriptures that you highlighted, that conversion, yes, it's a point in time, but it continues through a person's life. And even right now, I think you mentioned that as we're going through COVID-19 and different racial tensions in society, we're also going through a conversion process, even right now, which I thought was very interesting insight. So one of the things that we discussed when you were on last time was that your favorite book is the book of Luke. And I'm getting it a little bit. I think with some of my more recent forays into outcasts in society and a lot of the injustice, it definitely has ticked up in terms of a very important book, for me. And I'm actually going through it right now. I think I read Luke 23, today. But I wanted to just go ahead and start out and find out, why the book of Luke is your favorite gospel.
Thanks for that. And I don't know if you can see the background I have, but it's actually an icon of Luke, who was often painted in just this way as himself a painter, painting Madonna and child. There's Mary and Jesus from the infancy narratives. There's interesting work in the psychological sciences about what happens when you read a narrative. For example, there's research that demonstrates that if you read all of Harry Potter, which is thousands and thousands of pages, the research shows that you come out of that experience with more compassion than you had going in to reading Harry Potter. And this isn't something that the books lay out in front of you. It's not a theme that comes up in some sort of explicit way where the narrator, breaks in and tells you what's going on. It's simply they say in those novels that the various categories of difference, as people encounter different kinds of people, that rubs off on the reader when the reader wasn't even looking, right? The reader wasn't even thinking about it, but it rubs off. And the end result is a little bit of a different kind of person afterward than before. Well, when I think about that, I think about how narratives shape who we are, how narratives make sense of our lives. And in fact, typically when we try to make sense of what's happened in our own lives, we do it in a narrative form. We talk about the past, we talk about the present, we talk about where this is headed, the future. That's nothing but a narrative, movement through time with a narrative. Luke, it seems to me, is especially interesting in this regard, because if you're reading the Gospel of Luke, you're just reading, not trying to, dive down on this theme or this motif, or just reading the Gospel of Luke, then Luke is shaping a certain kind of reader, a certain kind of follower of Jesus, a certain kind of Christian. And that Christian would end up to be someone who is compassionate. That's clearly a key thing that runs through Luke. Someone who is open to learning from people who live on the underside or on the margins, because that's, again, something that happens a good bit in Jesus' ministry. And the degree to which you identify with Jesus as he moves through the Gospel of Luke is the degree to which you become what Jesus himself calls in Luke 6, a child of God. someone who reflects in their own lives God's own mercy and compassion, even toward the wicked and the ungrateful. So my favorite gospel is Luke, probably in large part because I've been so focused on it for so long. And I often say, yeah, I grew up in Texas, and I moved to Scotland and then to California and so on. But for a long time, I've been on a journey with Luke. I think my sense of identity, my sense of faith has been shaped a great deal by my love of this narrative.
Well, how did you first get into Luke? I understand what you're saying, like over time it's become that, but how did it first start?
Almost by mistake. That is, it's not something I set out to do. I actually, when I finished my PhD back in 1985, I assumed I would go in the Paul direction.
Okay.
I had done my dissertation on the death of Jesus, and so I'd focused a lot on the Gospels. And I had a really large chapter on the death of Jesus in Luke. But the end result of that is I was asked by the late F.F. Bruce, sort of the father of 20th century evangelical biblical scholarship. I was asked by Fred Bruce to write the commentary on Luke for the New International Commentary on the New Testament.
That's the big thick book.
Yeah.
I think I saw that. Okay. Yeah.
And so I of course said yes. It was an amazing opportunity, but I also, went to my bookshelves, and saw how many commentaries on Luke there already were, and asked, what can I add to this? I mean, the amount of analysis already there is incredible. So I over a few years began to get more and more interested in not in tradition, the traditions that Luke used as he wrote, his sources and all of that, and more interested in the story that he wrote, a narrative approach. And that's what led me into Luke, and then into Acts, and that's where I've spent a lot of my time.
So I guess, not to pull on that thread too much, but like aren't all the Gospels like narratives in a sense? So what makes Luke more of a narrative in that sense that stood out to you?
It's not more of a narrative. Luke does call what he's doing. It's in Luke 1:1-4. Many have penned a narrative, a diegesis in Greek. Many have done this. Luke calls what he's doing a narrative, but obviously Matthew, Mark, and John are also narratives. Luke is the only one who takes you from John the Baptist all the way through the church in Rome in Acts 28, Paul in Rome at that time. So he's unique in that respect. And, those who study Mark would probably say Mark is their most, the one they're most fond of, and they'll talk about that. It's a shorter narrative. Jesus in Mark is always teaching, but Mark doesn't record much of what he says. Matthew is less narrative and more blocks of teaching. And so they're all narratives, but they do it differently. And in fact, it's the same story in each case, but they narrate it differently, and therefore it takes on different significance.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. So I know in Luke chapter 1, we have the Song of Mary, the Magnificat. And I think you had mentioned at one point in one of the YouTube videos, I think I saw that this is an important, understanding this passage is important in understanding the entire book. Can you break that down a little bit?
Yeah, thanks for that question, because it's something I enjoy talking about. The text that's usually regarded as really programmatic sets the tone for Luke's gospel is Luke 4:16-30, Jesus' sermon at Nazareth. The Spirit of the Lord.
I love that, by the way. I love that sermon.
It's a wonderful text, and it's a really important text for understanding both Luke and Acts. What I find interesting is the degree to which Luke I'm sorry, Jesus in Luke 4 is agreeing with Mary in Luke 1:46 to 55, the text you just mentioned, Mary's song or the Magnificat. The book I have coming out fairly soon called Discovering the Gospel of Luke actually takes the Magnificat, Mary's song, as a central text. It spends a couple of chapters looking at the history of interpretation of Mary's song, just to give people a sense of how people over the last 2,000 years have made sense of the Magnificat. And then when we get into the theology of Luke's gospel toward the end of the book, those 3 chapters, I start with Mary's song. Do you want to know about God in Luke? Look at Mary's song. Do you want to know about Jesus in Luke? Look at Mary's song. Do you want to know what discipleship means in Luke's gospel? Look at Mary's song, because so many of the important motifs are already there and just waiting to be teased out. So reflecting on Mary's song for me becomes a window into the larger theological significance of what Luke is doing. If you look at Mary's song, there's 2 parts. The first part has to do with Mary, and the second part has to do with Israel, and they actually overlap. One leads into the other. So Mary becomes representative of what God is doing with Israel. There's a strong emphasis on tying the intervention of God to bring salvation into the Old Testament. And so you bring into the narrative what God has been doing with Israel, actually going back into Abraham and certainly Exodus and so on. So there's that reach. There's also the fact that every verb, once the Mary song gets started, every verb has God as the subject. God is doing this. God is doing this. God is doing this. God is doing this. And so some people like to see Mary's song as a kind of call for humans to take up the revolution. But it's really about God, if you will, taking up the revolution, although laying out also what it means to follow God and value what God values. And then there's the reversal motif that is so strong, transposition, the mighty from their thrones, raised up to humble, send the rich away empty, fill the poor with good things, the hungry with good things. So there's just so much there to reflect on. And then, as I say, it becomes a front door into the rest of the gospel.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I love how that Luke 1:46 and onwards, like a kernel, like a computer program, like the kernel into understanding everything. That's awesome. Or a window. So one of the things that I really love that you mentioned, I think, about the book of Luke, I think I had read this also, is that Jesus is more inclusive than he is exclusive. So his association with tax collectors and sinners stands out mightily, including the outcast, and caring for the poor and so forth. So can you share about that a little bit in the book of Luke?
Yeah, I certainly can. A good place to look at that is already in Luke 4, in the Nazareth sermon. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. And there's that word poor, which for many of us, we hear that in purely economic terms. And of course it has economic ramifications, material consequences. But the way it gets developed in Jesus' sermon in Luke 4 is it's related to the blind, the captive, the enslaved who are set free. It's related then to the stories of Elijah and Elisha, where God's intervention goes to non-Jews, a woman, a leper. So already the word poor is being understood not simply in economic terms, but in terms of what we might call people who live on the fringes, people who live on the margins. It has to do with the category of people that we call them.
Mhm.
Whoever us is, it's them.
Yeah, also other can also sometimes be
Yeah,
considered other.
exactly.
Yeah.
It's the other. Um, so if you follow then how that leads into the rest of the gospel, who does Jesus hang out with? Well, you see him being a friend of sinners. You see him involved with toll collectors or tax collectors and sinners. You see him with women. You see him with people who live on the fringes. That it's not only people on the fringes that he's living with, or he's associating with. He'll have dinner with Pharisees as well, as he does say in Luke chapter 14. But even there, he's calling into question certain patterns of life that go against the poor. And so he says, you come into a dinner party and you start looking for the seats of honor. No, take the seats at the bottom of the table so that you might be brought forward. Who should you invite to your dinner parties? Should you invite people who can reciprocate? I invite you, you invite me, and it's all over, friends and family. No, invite the very people who cannot reciprocate, because you will be repaid, Jesus says, in the resurrection. So it's as if to say that you understand discipleship means friendship with the marginal people, with the friends, with the other, and that's the kind of discipleship that Luke countenances, that he supports, that he affirms, and that's again a way of being like Jesus.
So like today, like do you I guess when I think about how Jesus was then and how the church is now in some respects, how do you think Jesus, or what words do you think Jesus might have for I guess maybe certain churches, I'll just put it that way, in
Right.
reference to how they're doing things versus how he has, kind of laid things out, as at least portrayed in the book of Luke. What would he, I guess, what words would he have for them
Yeah.
in your
Well,
estimation?
I mean, I'm thinking, for example, about Jesus, his comments in chapter 18 of Luke, where, let the little children come to me. To the kingdom of God belongs to people like that. There's a certain sense in which children in our society are celebrated, but I think actually it's often the case that the idea of children is celebrated. We still talk about children in churches as the future rather than the present. But I also think that in our society in North America, the people who would be honored in the first century would be older people. But in our society, it's often older people who get pushed to the side and regarded as irrelevant, or I mean, in a society based on economics, they aren't producing, they're not important. And then the degree to which churches do either one of those or both, and then the degree to which churches basically come to serve themselves. I've heard one person say, we support the church with our money, the church should be doing this for us. And the notion that the church should be open-handed to their own neighborhoods and to the people across the street is not something that's sort of built into the DNA of a lot of places, a lot of churches. And then the degree to which churches tend toward either all one color, all one socioeconomic status. It's the old principle of like attracts like. That's the degree to which churches are not living into or serving well the vision of God's royal rule that Jesus lays out. Years ago, when my family and I lived up in Northern California, I was a co-pastor of a little church that was half American-born Chinese, and a few Anglos, and half Chinese-born Chinese, ABC, and overseas-born Chinese, OBC. And the other pastor was Shanghai-born Chinese. He was fully bilingual, amazingly so. And I would preach often in English. He would translate it into Chinese. And there were, I would say, 50 of us that gathered on Sunday morning, maybe 60. And we were asked over and over again, my wife and I, why do you go to this little church? It's such a small church. I mean, what influence is there, et cetera, et cetera. And we always responded by referring to Revelation chapter 7. When we come before the throne, it's not going to be people of one color, one language, one ethnicity. It's all that are there singing praises to God. And so what we were basically saying is, if that's what God is interested in, then that's the kind of thing we want to be involved in now. And that means putting aside some of what measures quote unquote success in terms of a church life these days.
Mm-hmm. No, that's awesome. And I think that's also others focused literally rather than yourself, because you could have been more like, hey, I want to be on this track to do this and that, and for it to be all about you, but it was more about others, which I think is definitely the heart that Jesus, shows in the Gospels and other places. So another aspect of the book of Luke is the journey motif, which I know you mentioned in your book, Conversion in Luke and Acts, the people of the way and so forth, that conversion is a point in time, but also a process. And I know we discussed this when we had our discussion a few months ago or so, but can you cover that briefly?
Sure. Well, let me say two things. One is the motif of journeying, the theme of journeying shows up right away in the beginning of Luke and goes all the way through. In the beginning of Luke, John the Baptist, he's not even a thing yet, but Gabriel, the angel of the Lord, is saying to his father, he will turn, he will bring. I mean, there's journey language already being used for John the Baptist. And then with reference to the ministry of John the Baptist in Luke chapter 3, this is a citation from Isaiah chapter 40. There's the focus on preparing the way, the path, preparing the road, preparing the way of the Lord. And then so much of Jesus' ministry in Luke 9 all the way through 19 is a journey. And the funny thing about that journey is that he doesn't ever seem to go very far. There aren't, sort of like an itinerary. Here's where he is on the map now. Here's where he is on the map now. We're told repeatedly that he's traveling, but he doesn't seem to go very far. And he certainly takes a long time to get from Galilee down to Jerusalem. So it's as if the emphasis is on the journey, not on the itinerary, if that makes sense, on the way. And this on the way notion is tied to Jesus teaching the disciples what it means to call God, God, what it means to refer to God as Father, as it says in Luke chapter 11 in the Lord's Prayer, or even in Luke chapter 12. What does that mean? And so it's a long process of disciple making or disciple formation. And for me, that's one of the really important emphases that you find if you just trace a person like Peter from the beginning where he's first mentioned until way into the book of Acts, say Acts 15. Because you see, Peter doesn't get everything right in Luke, let's say chapter 5, and the call to be a disciple.
Not until chapter 10 he gets some revelation, and then other places.
Yeah, it keeps happening.
Right.
So it's a process, or as I say, a journey of formation or transformation that he undergoes. And when you think about it, why not? I mean, he's already been formed. And so it's not like he, in one fell swoop, he's going to become unformed and reformed in a moment. It's not to say that that can't happen. It just is to say that's not the norm for the people we see in the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. It takes a while to unlearn, or sometimes I call it to be refamilied, to be re-reared, to be reformed into the people that we're called to be. I mean, your program refers to the divine image. If we have resisted being God's image,
Mm-hmm.
It's not like suddenly we reflect who God is 100%.
Mm-hmm.
It's a process that takes time. It takes transformation. It takes conversion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that theology of conversion is a point in time. Someone says a prayer, which I don't necessarily see that as biblical myself, and then doesn't matter what they do the rest of their life. They've got the golden ticket, so to speak. I don't see that in the scriptures. I see more of a, yes, it is a point in time when someone is converted, but that conversion continues over time. And I think that's very important to understand, for people to understand. So they continue their faith. They don't like, oh, I'm done, I'm good,
Well, interestingly, for a lot of people, there's a journey before you even get to the point,
Sure.
to the point.
Mm-hmm.
You have to take some steps even to get to the place where you're willing to receive. But as you say, now the point becomes the beginning of a process
Right.
that continues on. Yeah. When I don't know if we've talked about this before, but I for some years was involved in ministry in prisons, in jails, and it was stunning to see how many people would refer back to when they were 7 years old or when they were 8 years old as the point where they became a Christian. And it's as if they understood that point, 20 years ago, as everything, as the whole shebang.
Right.
And
Right.
the notion that point might open up to growth in Christ likeness just simply wasn't part of the message that they received.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it definitely is a process, as you said, before there's a point in time and then afterwards, which I think is very important for us to understand. So just moving on real quick. So I know in Luke chapter 11, the disciples asked Jesus, they say, teach us to pray, which kind of leads into like a spiritual formation concept, if you will. Can you share about spiritual formation in the book of Luke?
Yeah. Luke has, as I sometimes say, he has more prayer going on per square inch than any other place in the Gospels. Jesus prays. Even look at his baptism. While Jesus was praying, the Spirit came upon him. While Jesus was praying, that phrase comes up a good bit. So Jesus himself is a model of prayer, but he's also teaching his disciples to pray. The example you just gave, of course, is what we sometimes call the Lord's Prayer, but he has teaching on prayer as well in Luke 18, for example. The funny thing, maybe it's not so funny, is that the disciples don't actually pray. Jesus keeps telling them how and telling them to pray, but it's only in Acts that they began to put into place the habits of prayer that he's been instructing them on in the Gospel of Luke. And so there's an interesting continuity and discontinuity as you go from Luke into Acts. And the message of prayer in Luke now begins to be embodied in the church already in Acts chapter 1, where they're gathered in prayer. That's part of Luke's understanding of Christian formation, spiritual formation. He also has things to say about, for example, simplicity, in other words, economics. He has things to say about table fellowship and so on, all as part of what it means to be formed into Christ likeness. So prayer is certainly part of it, a big part of it. And in the book of Acts, it's typically in prayer that the witnesses, what's the right way to say this? It's where they become aware of the next steps and of the movement still further out toward the Gentiles or toward other parts of the Roman Empire.
Mhm. Yeah, that's awesome. So one of the other things that I have heard about the book of Luke is that the Greek in the book of Luke is of a higher quality, I guess I could say, than the rest of the New Testament. And I know you teach a course, I think LG 510, and I think another course on Greek. Can you share a little bit about the Greek in the book of Luke?
Yeah, the easy way for me to say this is that generally when we talk about intro to Greek, we're talking about, John and Mark and so on, relatively simple Greek. When you teach intermediate Greek, you're often thinking of Luke and Acts and First Peter, Hebrews. So there's some examples of more difficult Greek, which means more classical, more literary in the case of Luke. And then when you teach advanced Greek, you're often leaving the New Testament altogether and looking at, say, the Septuagint or into the Greek around the New Testament, maybe even into the Apostolic Fathers. So Luke starts out with something that might remind you of good classical Greek, good ancient Greek, Luke 1:1-4. And then beginning with Luke 1:5, Luke 1:1-4 is the little preface where he says what he's going to do. Luke 1:5 begins the birth narrative. And for those two chapters, Luke 1:5 through the end of chapter 2, Luke sounds like he's doing the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint. So he changes style pretty radically from Luke 1:4 to Luke 1:5. And then as things begin to settle down, he's using a more literary Greek, not the kind of Greek you would typically find in the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament. So he has some training. He has some dexterity, some able to move with his Greek. It's because it's narrative, it sometimes takes on more of a literary form, but it is a more difficult Greek than you find, say, in the Gospel of John or the Gospel of Mark.
Okay. So last few questions before we wrap it up. I know you wrote, I think it's through a publisher right now, as you mentioned, the book Discovering the Gospel of Luke. What made you decide to write that? What's the reason behind that?
Yeah, it's a series of books called Discovering Biblical Texts, and I wrote the one on the Gospel of Luke, which should be out sometime in the spring, I would guess. It will function as a good entryway into the Gospel of Luke, and it could be used as a textbook in studies of Luke, for example. And as I mentioned earlier, it looks at the Magnificat, the Mary Song, as a sort of a window into the larger work of Luke. And so I do some history of interpretation. Here's how Christians have been reading this part of Luke. I go into what I call mapping Luke. So I locate Luke within the Roman world and also try to lay out the outline of Luke, how it works, how it moves from beginning to end. And then I go into some theological questions. Who is God? Who is Jesus? What is discipleship? So that's the frame of the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely want to read that in reference to the discipleship aspect. That seems very interesting.
Yeah.
Last couple questions. Who is Theophilus? Is that an individual from your opinion? Or is that a group of people loved by God, or what? What's your thoughts?
Yeah, well, so Luke 1:4 refers to Theophilus, and Acts chapter 1 refers back to Theophilus. So this is what's often called a literary dedication, which really means Theophilus is the person who's going to help Luke get published. And what that means in the first century is he's going to get it into the hands of people who want to make copies. And then they'll make copies and they'll make copies and so on. So publishing doesn't look like what it didn't look like what it does look like today. Theophilus, since the early church, it's been recognized that Theophilus is a name that means either God, someone God loves, or someone who loves God. And so it's sometimes thought of as a metaphor for the reader, God lovers, or people that God loves. I think that's probably problematic, and I'll tell you why. If you look at dedications in ancient writings, it would be really abnormal to have here a stand-in, a metaphor, rather than an actual person. And then similarly, Luke refers to Theophilus as "Oh, excellent Theophilus," a high title, perhaps a knight in the Roman world, so someone of high status. So why would he refer to all of those God lovers out there as "Oh, excellent," using this high title? And it's also true that Theophilus is a well-known name of actual people in the first century. And so I think it's probably a real person who is going to help Luke get his book out into other people's hands.
Maybe that's also why you love the book, because I know you've written a number of books, so maybe you can relate to that aspect too.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks so much for your time. I definitely appreciate you giving us more of a window into the book of Luke. I definitely have learned a lot, and I think the other thing that I saw is that Luke, I think, talks about the poor and the downcast more than any other book, which I think is definitely on my heart, definitely these days with a lot of the challenges that we're facing in our world. And I appreciate, just your heart and your ministry, the way that you've really tried to emphasize that, whether it's being, with the Chinese church that you mentioned, congregation, these kinds of things, which is definitely needed, I think much needed today. So again, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. Blessings.
Okay, bye.